Today we're talking Saudi Arabia and how investors should no longer view the country as just another petrostate. In studio with me today, I have Suhail Suleiman. Suhail is Coronation's Joint Head of Global Emerging Markets Research and a portfolio manager with over 20 years' experience.
Thanks, Amika. It's good to be here and welcome to all. I think it's very important to understand that Saudi Arabia today is very different from the country that one would have encountered as recently as 5 or 6 years ago. They've set themselves a vision called Vision 2030, where they're trying to basically change the country and make it more sustainable as they move away from being a fossil fuel-driven economy.
Suhail, what are the main emerging markets you'd expect to see in the Global Emerging Markets Fund, and how have these changed over the years?
Yeah, actually the change has been quite significant. When we launched our products, our strategy from sort of late 2007 onward. If one remembers, this was the tail end of the commodities boom, and it was commodity countries which dominated the benchmark. So as an example, Brazil at the time was about almost a fifth of the benchmark, and China was like 13-14%. And then the likes of Russia and South Africa and Mexico were all quite significant markets. Now, if you fast forward now, after a decade and a bit of stagnation, and with the COVID pandemic and several other big changes in the EM universe, you actually have China being the dominant market now. It peaked at close to 40% in late 2021. It's come down a bit now. It's about a third, but it's very, very different from what one encountered 13, 14 years ago. It's a lot more Asia-focused between China, India, Taiwan and South Korea. You've got almost 75-80% of the investable universe in just those 4 countries.
And how did Saudi Arabia become part of the emerging markets, and when did this happen?
So Saudi Arabia has always been investable, and for example, our Frontiers products and other products that Coronation offers have invested in Saudi Arabia historically. But they aspire to be more than what we would call frontier markets, and so they set about with improving access to their local market, reducing capital controls, listing more companies, and just meeting additional requirements that MSCI has. And as a result of that, they graduated, for want of a better word, into EM status in 2019. I think it was in May.
And how has Saudi Arabia done since entering the emerging market space, and what was this due to?
It's done very well. I mean, part of the reason why it's done so well is because it was under-owned, and it started off with sort of 1.5% weight in the benchmark, and today it's over 5%. So it's now bigger than South Africa within the benchmark. I think part of the reason why Saudi Arabia has done so well, there's a lot of capital flowing into the region. Obviously, the oil price having gone up, and all the liquidity that goes with that has helped to boost returns. So you would have done quite well having invested in Saudi Arabia from the time it entered the benchmark.
Suhail, you mentioned this Vision 2030. How does it fit into the overall Saudi government program?
Yes, so Vision 2030 is sort of a series of long-term targets. I mean, obviously, the end game for the company, or for the country rather, is to transition away from being an oil-driven economy. And then the other issue that they have is that women had zero representation in public life at all until very recently. So outside of limited roles in academia, for example, or dedicated retail jobs catering only to fellow females, you wouldn't really come across women in public life at all. And so one of the big things that they've done there is to improve women's participation in the formal economy. I saw a statistic that labor force participation, or the percentage of women in formal employment, has gone from sort of 15% of the total formal employment to 30% in the space of 3 or 4 years. So that's quite significant. But also very important is they need to move beyond hydrocarbons. So they want to develop infrastructure, they want to develop other sources of energy, they want to improve tourism. And the country's got 1,600 kilometers worth of coastline along the Red Sea. Now, we all know Sharm el-Sheikh and all these beautiful resorts on the Red Sea side of Egypt, but none of us had ever heard of any of these in Saudi Arabia. So I think when they're done with all of this here, the country will be very different from what it was a generation ago. I think there's also the sort of the flagship projects. We've seen these huge futuristic cities, that NEOM project that at a micro level you will see big changes for the person on the ground, because the previous way of doing things, where you got huge subsidies from the government in return for just living a subsistence type existence, that's not sustainable if oil prices collapse, and particularly if the world moves beyond oil as the primary source of energy.
Members of the Coronation Emerging Markets team made a maiden trip to the capital city of Riyadh in November 2022 to meet with Saudi corporates, and came away with an impression of a country with a massive drive to transform itself within the next 10 years. What sort of companies will you find there, and what are some of the most interesting companies that you met that you might want to invest in one day?
So we saw the whole range of companies listed in Saudi Arabia. I mean, we didn't want to just go there and look for more of the same that we come across in other emerging markets. Interestingly, you think Saudi Arabia, and knowing that Aramco, which is their state-owned monopoly oil extractor, because one knows that's listed, you would think that's the largest investable stock in the country. But because so much of it is owned by the government, actually within the benchmark, the biggest exposures are the banks. So we've got Al Rajhi Bank and Saudi National Bank are the two big ones. Why we found them quite interesting is that credit penetration in Saudi Arabia is quite low. It's sort of in line with other middle-income countries, but if you compare overall credit penetration in things like retail and mortgages, it's actually very low compared to other middle-income countries. So most of the loans currently are to the corporate sector. So there's a huge opportunity for the consumer sector to increase their leverage. Another interesting company that we came across was the stock exchange, but it's actually the 11th largest exchange in the world by market cap. And Saudi Arabia is not the 11th largest economy in the world. So that was quite interesting to come across that as well.
And outside of the opportunities that you just mentioned, were there any other specific ideas that you came across that are particularly unique to Saudi Arabia?
Yeah, so we met with the largest gym operator in the country, but actually until a couple of years ago, there were no gyms for women. So unless you were like a member of a private club, typically attached to a 5-star Western hotel, it was almost impossible for females to go to gym. But the capital flowing into the sector has meant that now there's hundreds of these female gyms. A lot of this happened just before the pandemic, and so you had this flood of capital come into the sector, and no one went for a year and a half or 2 years. So it's just kind of coming out of that COVID-induced lull in sustainability.
When one thinks of what Saudi Arabia has to offer, what is of particular interest to South Africans?
That's a very good question, and I think it's very topical right now, because ultimately what we're experiencing here in South Africa, I suppose there's two big things that are hitting us. One is existential right now, which is the electricity shortage, and the other one I think is more longer term in nature. We're hearing a lot about water infrastructure collapsing. So part of Vision 2030 is that the government wants to have 60 gigawatts of renewable power coming on stream by that year. That would double the current electricity output of the country. Just to give you an idea, 60 gigawatts is the theoretical installed capacity that Eskom currently has in this country. Of course, we know that we're running at sort of 50% of the installed capacity. So we're producing 30 gigawatts actually in SA at the moment, and we're experiencing load shedding. So Saudi Arabia, a country with half our population, is going to put in double our current output in the next 10 years for solar alone. So I found that quite interesting. And also what was very interesting is the cost. The typical cost of installation is around 2.6 US cents per kilowatt hour. So a kilowatt hour is what when we buy, if you have a prepaid meter, you pay whatever, R2.50, you get 1 unit. That's 1 kilowatt hour of electricity that you're buying for R2.50. The cost of production in Saudi Arabia is 2.6 US cents. For solar. I mean, that's incredibly cheap. If you convert that to South African currency, that's 45 cents. So, if we could replicate that here, I think it would solve, firstly, a lot of our issues with energy availability, and then secondly, it would be very, very competitive against things like coal or nuclear or anything else that people are talking about in South Africa. And then the other one, which I thought was quite interesting, was desalinated water. Now, Saudi Arabia has got tons of land, tons of sunshine, but very little water. So they have to desalinate water. It's typically the Israelis who've been considered at the forefront of desalination technology, and that probably still is the case. But what Saudi Arabia has that the Israelis don't have is very cheap energy. Converting seawater into usable fresh water is very energy intensive. So if your energy costs are very high, then the cost of producing water is very high. In Saudi Arabia, they've managed to get that cost down to around 10 rands per thousand liters. So 1,000 liters is what your municipality typically bills you as one unit. And it starts off here at sort of 3 rands, 4 rands, and then as you use more, of course, the price goes up significantly. But I think 10 rand is very, very competitive. So in a water-starved society, one could take care of most of the basic requirements at that sort of price. It's quite competitive. So in South Africa, for example, if we do start having water issues or a recurrence of a day zero type scenario, I think there's a lot we can learn from Saudi Arabia in that regard.
Absolutely. And Sohail, to conclude, what would be your key takeaways from the investment case for Saudi Arabia?
Yeah, I think the most important thing is like when you go there, you realize it's not just about oil. But in terms of being on track and moving in the right direction, perhaps heading more towards the other Gulf states like Dubai and Qatar, which are much more open societies, I think Saudi Arabia is firmly down that path. Maybe they never need to diversify away from oil, but I think if they do ever end up in a situation where oil isn't the be-all and end-all of their existence, I think they are putting themselves on the right footing to be able to manage that quite well.
It sounds as if there are quite exciting and interesting opportunities available in Saudi Arabia. Have you included any of these in the Global Emerging Markets Fund at the moment?
So the flip side of having had such a strongly performing market in the last couple of years is that the Saudi market is a little bit on the expensive side. So we look to buy attractively priced businesses as well, and I think there are a few which are getting close, and we will likely make our first investment in Saudi Arabia in the next couple of weeks, and we hope to have it as a material part of the portfolio in the years ahead.